Howdy, Smite fans. It's J-Mac here. Week number 2 of the SPL is all wrapped up, and we had some rather close matchups amongst the top and bottom teams within the league, and then we also had some absolute beatdowns amongst the rest. Well, let's take a look back at week number 2 and see what all happened in this week's episode of the SPL Weekly Recap. And to start the week off on Friday, we kicked off with the Jade Dragons against the Olympus Bolts. A storied rivalry between these two teams kicked off with the Olympus Bolts picking apart the multi-hunter comp of the Dragons in Game 1. Without a true initiator or tank for the Dragons, the late-game team fighting of the Bolts and their early pressure and duo netted the Bolts a win in Game 1. Game 2 was much the opposite, with the Dragons jungler leading the charge in the early game, and FinoK playing the frontline bully late to take Game number 2. In Game number 3, it simply came down to the Bolts having too much sustain in the late-game team fights. Venenu's Hell out-healed the pressure of the Dragons, and the Bolts took the set 2-1. And our second set was the Tartarus Titans against the Oni Warriors. This set went against expectations, with the Oni Warriors, Vote and Cubo Fred specifically, popping off in both of their games to not only take control of the early game, but transitioning those into late-game team fights to take the 2-0 set over the Tartarus Titans in a rather convincing fashion. Saturday started off with the Solar Scarabs against the Valhalla Valkyries. And even though the Scarabs took this set, it stayed interesting throughout. Game 1 was a convincing win for the Scarabs, but Game 2 had an impressive comeback for the Valkyries after going down so far in the early game. And then in Game number 3, we got what was essentially a role swap from the Scarabs that sent both the fans and the Valks into a state of a razzle-dazzle, and the Scarabs are able to take the set 2-1. And then next up, we had the Jade Dragons back again, this time against the Atlantis Leviathans. Game 1, again, the Dragons' multi-hunter comp could not stand up enough against the more traditional Leviathans draft. Once the late-game team fights broke out, the Leviathans overpowered the Dragons for a Game 1 win. Game 2 was anything but close, however, as the Dragons dismantled the Leviathans with ease. Any and every fight, the Dragons had overwhelmed the Levi's and closed out the game in just 21 minutes. Game number 3, the Leviathans took an early lead, and that ballooned out of control into a massive 13k gold lead once the late game came around. However, the Dragons repelled the Fire Giant Leviathans at the left Phoenix and punched back and took the Leviathans Phoenix instead. And after that, and one more enhanced Fire Giant, the Dragons, from such a huge deficit, swept the rug from under the Levi's to take game number 3 and the set 2-1. And now we've reached Sunday, and our opening set was the Olympus Bolts against the Oni Warriors. And even despite the best efforts of the Warriors' early game play, the Bolts are the ones who found successful objective play and team fights throughout the mid-game to turn around each of these games into their favor. The Bolts rallied together and take both games from the Warriors to find the set with a 2-0 win. And our second set of Sunday was the Tartarus Titans against the Valhalla Valkyries. Game 1 was a rather convincing win for the Titans, with the Valks unable to make their mark in any of their lanes. And game number 2 started out really good for the Valkyries, with Kirmi on an early killing spree, but a questionable Fire Giant pull nearly wiped the Valks, and the Titans took control of the game and won out the set with a 2-0. And finally, to close out our week, we had the Camelot Kings up against the Solar Scarabs. But this was not a particularly close set. The Kings dominated game number 1 and took the win in less than 20 minutes of play, unheard of in the current meta. Game 2, while better from the Scarabs, was still a devastating loss once the team fight stage broke out. The Camelot Kings 2-0 the Scarabs to round out week 2 of play. And there you have it. Another week of play has concluded, and 2 teams still remain at the top of the standings undefeated. It's the Camelot Kings and the Olympus Bolts. Look, it's only week number 2, and we still have plenty of games to go. The action's been non-stop and explosive, and I don't expect it to slow down anytime soon. Make sure that you catch up on all the action on our YouTube channel, SMITEPod. Catch the behind-the-scenes content over on our SMITEPro YouTube channel, where you can tune in for week number 3 live right now on twitch.tv/SmiteGame. I've been J-Mac, and this has been the SPL Weekly Recap.